The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps trapped in plastic. Oak Creek Memorial's night shift ran on skeleton crew, 2 nurses per floor, 1 resident who'd rather sleep than round, and Dr. Caldwell, who arrived early because insomnia and arrogance went hand in hand. The ER at 0230 in Jacksonville felt like a holding pattern between emergencies, that particular kind of quiet that made the living seem fragile and temporary. Danielle Ross moved through it like she didn't quite exist. Her scrubs were 2 sizes too large, deliberately oversized, the way she wore her brown hair pulled tight enough to erase her face from memory. The limp was real, left leg favoring the right side, the kind of compensation pattern that only came from months of physical therapy after field medicine turned personal. She checked the vitals on bed 4 without announcement, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, heart rate steady. Her fingers moved across the monitor screen with the precise efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, maybe more. The patient was stable. She'd made sure of it before the day's shift ended, before the skeleton crew took over, before the hospital settled into its nightly rhythm of beeping machines and fluorescent hum. At 0247, a collapsed line in bed 7 sent muscle memory into motion. The 4 catheter had infiltrated, the surrounding tissue swollen and cool to the touch, the line useless. A newer nurse, fresh from orientation, was already reaching for supplies with trembling hands when Danielle appeared beside her without being called. "Move," she said quietly. Not unkindly. Just a fact. Her hands didn't shake as she selected a 20-gauge angiocath, found the radial artery at the wrist with her fingertips alone, and slid the needle in. The flash came immediately. Bright red blood in the chamber. She advanced the catheter, secured it with practice tape work, and had the line running normal saline in 45 seconds. The trembling nurse watched her work like she was watching someone else's hands that didn't belong to a floor nurse but to something older, something that had learned efficiency in places where inefficiency meant body bags. "That's how you do it when you're short on time," Danielle said, writing the insertion time in the chart, 0249. Documentation matters. It's the only thing that protects you when something goes wrong. The younger nurse nodded, not quite understanding that the real protection came from knowing what you were doing before you had to do it at speed under fire. The break room smelled like old coffee and the synthetic vanilla of cleaning products that couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of hospital, that blend of antiseptic and something trapped, something waiting. Danielle sat alone at 0315, unwrapping a meal prep container with precisely portioned chicken and rice that she'd prepared 72 hours earlier. Efficiency in everything. She poured coffee from the pot that had been burning since first shift, and the liquid came out thin and bitter. She drank it anyway. The mug in her hands read "World's Okayest Nursed" in fading letters, a gift from someone who'd meant well and didn't understand that she'd been more than that once. The ceramic was cracked along the base, held together by muscle memory and habit. She turned it slowly, watching the letters blur. Inside her scrubs, against the collarbone, she wore a dog tag on a broken chain. The metal was worn smooth from touching, from the specific weight of guilt that never quite left. She found it now, pressing her thumb across the engraved letters, Martinez. They'd been together at Sangin, her and Martinez and 8 other personnel of Task Force Shadowlight, running a field hospital in a concrete tent that took mortar fire on Tuesday. That was the day Martinez didn't make it to extraction. That was the day everything got classified and buried so deep that people who'd been there stopped existing on paper. The dog tag belonged to someone else. She shouldn't have had it. But when you carry a body 3 kilometers through sniper fire and that body doesn't make it home in any official capacity, you keep the thing that proves he was real. That he existed. That someone, somewhere, needed to know. She tucked the chain back inside her scrubs where it belonged, invisible to everyone but the metal detector and the federal database that had flagged her clearance at Hieron. They'd never asked about it. They'd never asked about anything. That was the deal with the burial. You disappear into civilian life, you keep your mouth shut, and they let you breathe. Danielle went back to work at 0330. The shift progressed like most shift progressed, small emergencies masquerading as crises, the elderly coming in with chest pain that turned out to be anxiety, a teenager with a laceration that needed 15 stitches and a tetanus update. She moved between beds with her characteristic silence, her presence announced only by the soft sound of rubber gloves snapping on, the quiet click of her badge against the ID reader, the methodical squeaking of sneakers on linoleum that had been scrubbed too many times. The other night nurses knew not to ask her personal questions. They'd learned that her responses came in single words or didn't come at all. New staff sometimes tried anyway, testing the boundary of friendliness, and she'd respond with sufficient politeness to avoid formal complaint but enough distance to discourage further inquiry. It was a balance she'd perfected over 3.5 years at Oak Creek. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 0515 for rounds that didn't technically start until 0600. He was the kind of surgeon who used time as a weapon, arriving early so he could watch his staff scramble, leaving late so he could observe who was tired and therefore vulnerable. He moved through the ER with the deliberate pace of someone who'd learned that silence made people nervous. He watched Danielle through the glass partition of the nurse's station where she sat charting the vitals from the night. Her handwriting was precise, compact, the kind of medical documentation that defense attorneys would love, clear, dated, accurate, impossible to later contradict. Caldwell had been head of the ER for 7 years, long enough to know that control meant knowing everything and everyone knowing that you knew. He'd built the department on rigid hierarchy, his orders ran through the residents, through the attending physicians, through the nurses, and finally to the techs and aides at the bottom. Danielle occupied a strange space in that hierarchy. She was technically a floor nurse, but her competence was the kind that made junior residents listen to her, the kind that made families feel safer when she was in the room instead of someone with more credentials but less composure. Yesterday, during rounds, she'd caught an error. A simple one, heparin dosage calculation, 30 units per kilogram, 8,000 unit bolus for an 80 kilogram patient. Caldwell had written 12,000. The error would have been caught eventually, but Danielle had spoken quietly, her hand not quite raised, her voice not quite a question. That dosage is high for a patient this weight, doctor. Did you want me to verify the calculation? In front of the resident. In front of the medical student. In front of people who were supposed to see him as infallible. He'd corrected it without acknowledging the mistake, without thanking her, without anything but a tightness around his eyes that promised he was keeping score. Now he approached the nurse's station where she was charting, and Danielle didn't look up. She knew he was there the way wounded animals know when they're being tracked. The air pressure changed. The fluorescent hum seemed to sharpen. She kept her pen moving across the paper, documenting the night's events with the same mechanical precision that had carried her through 16 hours in Sangin with nothing but a Leatherman tool and the determination that the 14 patients in her tent would breathe in and out until someone came to relieve her. "How was the night shift?" he asked. His voice was smooth, carefully modulated, the voice of a man who'd practiced control in front of mirrors. Danielle finished the sentence she was writing before she responded. Quiet. 2 4 placements, 1 laceration repair, 1 anxiety attack misidentified as cardiac event. The collapsed line in bed 7. She finally looked up. Her eyes were steady, the color of old rain. Infiltrated at 0247. Replaced with radial artery access. Patient stable. Caldwell smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that comes just before someone decides to teach a lesson about knowing your place. Next time, notify the attending physician before you make clinical decisions. That line could have held. It wasn't true. They both knew it wasn't true. Infiltrated for lines don't magically become functional again. But truth wasn't the point. The point was establishing who made decisions. Who controlled the room. Who mattered and who was just a nurse in oversized scrubs who should be grateful for the job. Understood, doctor, Danielle said quietly. She'd learned that compliance was armor. She went back to her charting, and Caldwell lingered for exactly 3 seconds longer than necessary, establishing that he could interrupt her work whenever he chose, that her time wasn't actually hers. Then he walked away, and the pressure in the room normalized, and Danielle's pen continued its mechanical motion across the documentation forms. But that wasn't the worst part. The real problem was that James Vickers, Navy SEAL Team 3, was being wheeled through those ER doors in exactly 38 hours, and when he arrived, the past was coming with him. The classified past. The buried past. The dog tag that didn't belong to her around her neck would suddenly become evidence of something far bigger than a night shift at a Jacksonville hospital. And the only thing worse than a secret getting out was a secret being held by someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Paging Danny the janitor to the ER. Danny the janitor, your mop is waiting. The overhead speaker crackled at 0700, Dr. Caldwell's voice echoing across 3 floors of Oak Creek Memorial like a slur broadcast through a megaphone. The central station froze. A resident covered her mouth. 2 nurses pretended to read their screens harder. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent drone as the pages faded into static. Danielle stood at the medication dispensary on the 3rd floor, her hands suspended over the controlled substance drawer. She had been reaching for a 500 milliliter vial of normal saline when his voice found her. Her hand didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. 1 measured breath in. 1 measured breath out. She closed the drawer with a soft metallic click and turned toward the hallway without acknowledging the frozen faces watching her. She walked past Dr. Caldwell at the central station without breaking stride. His eyes tracked her, waiting for flinching, for shame, for the small deflation of a person publicly humiliated. She gave him nothing. Not a pause. Not a glance. Just a nurse moving to her next task with the same invisible efficiency that had carried her through 16 hours under mortar fire in Sangin, holding a field hospital together with sutures and wool while men screamed and died around her. By the medication room on the 2nd floor, alone between shelves of 4 bags and cardiac medications, a single tear escaped down her left cheek. Not from shame. Not from hurt. From rage held so tightly in her chest that her body had to release it somewhere. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without looking in the mirror, without pausing, without letting it mean anything. The tremor in her wrist lasted 3 seconds. She made a fist. It stopped. By day 3, Caldwell had escalated to something sharper than public embarrassment. He had begun to hunt. Danielle was restocking the supply closet at 1,400 hours, reaching for gauze on the high shelf, when the door closed behind her. The space was 4 feet wide. The lighting was yellowish and dim. She didn't turn around, but she already knew it was him. She could smell the coffee on his breath before he spoke, the bitter scent mixing with the antiseptic tang of the closet's bleach residue. "You think you're smarter than me?" His voice was low, vicious, pitched to stay inside that narrow room. "You think your little corrections make you special? That you're the only one who can read a dosage calculation?" Danielle kept her hand on the gauze box. She could have moved. Should have moved. Instead she stood completely still, her posture unchanged, her breathing unchanged, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "I can have you scrubbing bedpans in geriatrics," he continued, stepping closer until his shoulder nearly touched hers. "Or I can have you gone entirely. Insubordination. That's what I'll write. Do you understand what that means for your future, Danielle? 1 word from me and no other hospital in Florida will touch your resume." She could feel him trying to dominate the space, trying to make the closet smaller by filling it with his certainty. This was a competent man using institutional power the way surgeons use scalpels, calculated, practiced, effective. He had already made 3 phone calls to board members describing her as reckless. He had already documented the dosage incident with a timestamp. He was not just bullying. He was building a case. She turned to face him. Their eyes locked at a distance of 18 inches. 1 tear escaped down her left cheek. She didn't blink. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let him see it for exactly 2 seconds, then wiped it with the back of her hand in one smooth motion, her gaze never leaving his. "I've survived worse men than you, doctor." Not angry. Not trembling. Not breaking. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of flat certainty that makes the air pressure change in a room. She slid past him, her shoulder brushing his in the narrow space, not an accident, not an apology. A deliberate passing. She left the door open behind her and returned to work. By day 6, Caldwell was ready for the final move before what he probably thought would be her complete capitulation. He had already reassigned 3 of her support staff to different shifts, altered her schedule to isolate her on solo overnight rotations, and restricted her access to the medication dispensaries, small cuts that bled her of autonomy and community, the kind of tactical moves that preceded termination. The parking lot ambush happened at 06:45, just as the incoming shift was arriving. Danielle was walking toward the bus stop, her shift badge clipped to her scrubs, her coffee in a paper cup with a cardboard sleeve, when Dr. Caldwell intercepted her near the third row of employee vehicles. 18 staff members were clustered between their cars, unlocking doors, chatting, settling into the rhythm of a morning shift about to begin. They all watched as Caldwell positioned himself between Danielle and the street. "Effective immediately, you're reassigned to triage only," he announced, his voice loud enough to carry across the parking lot. "No patient contact beyond intake vitals. You're a liability I can't afford to keep anywhere near critical care. HR will have the paperwork ready by end of day." He smiled while he said it. A smile like a wolf showing its teeth, satisfied that he had finally broken through her composure, finally found the leverage to make her crumble. 20 years of medical practice, 8 of them as an ER director, and he had learned that people only stayed quiet when they were scared. Fear meant control. Fear meant compliance. Danielle set down her coffee on the hood of someone's blue Honda Civic. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. She took one breath. Then another. When she looked up at him, her face was completely clear of expression, not angry, not hurt, not defeated. Just empty of feeling in a way that was somehow more unsettling than any reaction he had engineered. "Understood," she said. She picked up her coffee and kept walking toward the bus stop. The incoming shift watched her go, watched her board the bus without looking back, watched the doors close and the bus pull away from the curb. A senior nurse whispered to another, "What did she do to him?" The other nurse shook her head and said, "Nothing." "That's what makes it worse." Caldwell stood in the parking lot, his chest still moving with the satisfaction of what he believed was victory, watching the bus disappear around the corner. He had no idea that the woman he had just demoted had held a field hospital together alone for 16 hours under enemy fire, had performed a battlefield amputation with a Leatherman and saved an entire SEAL squad, had carried her spotter's body through sniper fire for 3 kilometers over terrain that was supposed to be impassable. He didn't know that quiet people are dangerous not because they're broken, but because they're already willing to survive things most people can't imagine. 2 days later, on a Tuesday at 1,620 hours, a Navy SEAL training accident sent Commander James Vickers through the trauma bay doors of Oak Creek Memorial. Danielle was restocking the crash cart when the paramedics wheeled him in, their radio traffic urgent and clipped, male, 38, rappelling fall from 60 feet, unconscious at scene, possible C-spine injury, vital stable but tachycardic, ETA 2 minutes. She recognized his face immediately. The face from the courtroom 8 years ago. The officer who had sat across from her at her court-martial hearing in a JAG office in Kandahar province while she stood in dress uniform and listened to him testify that Major Danielle Ross had abandoned her post, that the deaths in Sangin were her responsibility, that her service record showed concerning gaps in judgment. He had buried the entire operation, the intelligence failures, the command breakdown, the reasons the mission was ever authorized in the first place, to protect his own career trajectory. To protect a Navy Cross that was supposed to be coming his way. Her entire body went rigid. The saline bag she was holding didn't drop, but her hands froze in place while the rest of the trauma team moved into position around the stretcher. Dr. Caldwell took the lead, barking orders. "Get him to Trauma Bay 3, 2 large bore 4s, call ortho and neuro, I want a full C-spine series stat." The team moved with practiced precision, cutting away Vickers' uniform, establishing for access, hooking him to monitors while his heart rate climbed from 108 to 116 on the display screen. Danielle forced her hands to keep moving. She hung a new saline bag on the 4-pole, her movements precise because precision was what her hands remembered. But her breathing had gone shallow, coming in through her nose in measured intervals that felt like holding back a scream. As they cut away the neck of his tactical training shirt, she saw it. A single dog tag on a broken chain, half hidden beneath the trauma blanket they were wrapping around him for spinal precautions. The name on the metal rectangle caught the fluorescent light, Martinez. Her spotter. Her team leader. The man who died in her arms in Sangin while Vickers was 5,000 miles away filing false reports and crafting testimony. Martinez, who had jokes for everything, who had a daughter he'd never met because his ex-wife refused to let him back in her life, who bled out through a femoral artery rupture at 03 for 7 hours while Danielle applied direct pressure and whispered promises she couldn't keep. Her hand trembled as she reached to check Vickers' pulse, her fingers finding the carotid artery with automatic precision. 94 beats per minute. Strong. Regular. A man unconscious and stable, completely unaware that the woman standing beside him had been present at his crime and had been ordered to forget it ever happened. Caldwell assigned her to monitor overnight vitals. "Even you can handle that," he said, and there was contempt in his voice, the satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally put her exactly where she belonged. Danielle accepted the assignment with a nod and no words, because words were dangerous and her hands were already trembling enough. That night at 2,300 hours, she stood at Vickers' bedside in the quiet of the ICU, watching his chest rise and fall in the rhythm of normal breathing. The monitors beeped their steady electronic heartbeat. The ventilation system hummed overhead. The world had gone completely still except for this, a man who had destroyed her career, now dependent on her hands to keep him alive. The dog tag caught the monitor light, glinting silver for 1 second before disappearing back into shadow. She reached out without thinking, her fingers extending toward the metal rectangle. She stopped herself with her hand 6 inches away, pulled back, turned away from the bed. A night nurse passed the doorway and asked if she was okay. "Fine," Danielle said. "Just a long shift." The nurse accepted this and kept moving down the corridor. Danielle opened his chart and began writing her vitals documentation, her handwriting perfect despite the tremor in her wrist, each letter formed with the precision of someone holding something back that, if released, would destroy everything in its path. The crash cart was 3/4 restocked when the radio crackled. Trauma alert. Training accident at Naval Station Mayport. ETA for minutes. Danielle didn't pause. Saline bags aligned themselves in her hands like a meditation, each movement exact, practiced 10,000 times before this moment. She was checking the defibrillator pads when the bay doors opened and the stretcher came through like a ship cutting water. Commander James Vickers lay on the gurney with his left leg bent at an angle that made the attending wince. Compound fracture. Possible vascular injury. His flight suit was torn at the hip, blood soaking through. 2 Navy corpsmen had him on supplemental oxygen, their movements sharp and economical. They transferred him to Bay 2 with the precision of people who had done this 100 times in places with names she couldn't say. She was reaching for the crash cart when she saw it. A dog tag. Single chain, the links broken as though someone had ripped it from his neck in a panic. Half hidden beneath the trauma blanket, but visible enough. She could read the lettering even from 3 feet away, even as her hands kept moving, kept working, kept her face level and unchanged. The name read Martinez. Her Martinez. Her spotter. The man who died in Sangin while this man filed false reports 5,000 miles away. Danielle's breath became very small. She looked at the patient's face. Vickers. Same jaw. Same eyes that had stared at her across the courtroom during the boards of inquiry, the officer who had orchestrated her erasure to cover intelligence failures that would have ended his career. She had spent 7 years invisible by choice. Now invisibility was a weapon she could use. She stepped toward the bed and Vickers' eyes found hers for half a second. Nothing registered. He didn't know her. The woman who had testified against him had been in dress uniform, all precision and anger. Now she was a night shift nurse in scrubs, her hair pulled back, her face a study in professional attention. Muscle memory overrode everything else. The surgical training. The field medicine. The part of her that had held a dying spotter's hand in a hospital no wider than this bay. She was already speaking. How long since injury? 42 minutes, one of the corpsmen said. His name tape read Clayton. Not her Clayton, different first name, but close enough that the universe seemed to be testing her composure in real time. GCS score 14. Some confusion but oriented to person and place. She was writing. Vitals. Time of injury. Blood loss estimate. Pain level. The questions that pulled the body apart into data points separated her hands from her heart. The training was working. The wall between the nurse and the woman was holding. Barely. 2 large bore 4s already placed. Yes. Running normal saline wide open. She nodded and checked the 4 lines herself, her fingers steady as if they belonged to someone else entirely. The tape was secure. The flow was good. She had seen Vickers' face in nightmares. She had practiced what she would do if she ever saw him again. She had imagined rage, confrontation, the satisfaction of making him understand what he had cost her. Instead, she was assessing his lung sounds with a stethoscope while his blood stained her shoes. X-ray is ready, the charge nurse called out. Orthopedics is scrubbing. They want him in OR within the hour. Danielle was already checking his pedal pulses, her touch clinical, her attention absolute. The left foot was cold. Pale. The pulse under her fingers was weak, thready. She felt the information travel through her hands and into the vault where she kept everything that mattered. The vascular injury was real. Without intervention, he would lose the leg. Without intervention, he might lose more than that. She documented every finding. Her handwriting was perfect. Her voice remained steady. Pedal pulse on the left is diminished. Foot is cool and pale. Need to alert orthopedics immediately about possible vascular compromise. He may need vascular surgery before general orthopedics. The attending nodded and moved to call the surgeons. Danielle stepped back and watched Vickers' oxygen sat climb. 98%. Good lungs. His heart rate was elevated, 110, but that was reasonable given the circumstances. He was breathing hard, pupils dilated from pain, but his mind was tracking. He looked at her again for a moment and she saw the moment he was about to speak, to ask her name or to thank her or to offer some human acknowledgement. She turned to the monitor before his mouth could move. The dog tag caught her eye again. Martinez. The way it lay against Vickers' chest. As if he had earned the right to wear a dead man's name. As if the court-martial had been enough, as if the silence had been enough, as if 7 years of invisibility had been payment for whatever he thought had happened in Sangin. I'm going to get vitals every 5 minutes until you're in the OR, she said. Her voice was different now. Deeper. The careful politeness had burned away like fog. Don't move that leg. Notify me immediately if you feel numbness in your foot or toes. Pain is data. Pay attention to it. He looked at her strangely. As if something in her tone had registered even though her face remained professional. Understood. She was charting his vitals when Dr. Caldwell appeared at the bay entrance, already looking for something to complain about, some minor detail he could weaponize into an assertion of dominance. He saw her writing. His jaw tightened. Is this patient on the surgical schedule? He asked her directly, the question designed to make her admit she had overstepped, that she had been making decisions instead of following orders. Awaiting orthopedics and vascular surgery consultation, she said without looking up. Presenting with compound fracture left femur, diminished pedal pulse, cool pale foot. High probability of vascular injury. Caldwell's face reddened slightly. She had answered the question correctly. There was nothing he could critique without sounding foolish. He turned away, muttering something about the schedule, about coordination with the oars. She watched him go and felt nothing. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just the absolute clarity of someone who understood that everything had changed 2 days ago when she restocked this crash cart and a broken dog tag came through the bay doors on the chest of a man who had tried to bury her alive. Vickers was stable. For now. His oxygen sat held at 97%. His heart rate had come down to 104. Pain management would come in the OR. The vascular surgery would happen within the hour. He would probably keep the leg. He would probably live. But something in the balance of the universe had shifted. She checked his neurostatus again, watching his eyes track her movements, watching him try to place her in the geography of his memory and failing. The invisibility was perfect. The wall between the woman and the nurse was unbreakable. And underneath, in a place she had learned not to visit, the single dog tag around his neck hummed with the weight of 7 years of silence. Tuesday at 0300, the underground gas main fractured beneath the parking lot and chlorine flooded the basement ventilation system in a silent tide that nobody saw coming. The first sign was a patient in Trauma Bay 2, a 48-year-old construction worker, whose body seized without warning, muscles locking in a tetanic convulsion that toppled the four-stand. Then another. Then 3 more in the waiting room, their eyes rolling back, their lungs fighting for air that had turned to caustic vapor. The fluorescent lights flickered once. Twice. The alarm system wailed. Dr. Caldwell stood behind the nurse's station, clipboard raised, barking orders into the chaos like a man directing traffic instead of saving lives. Evacuate the ER. Now. Wait for hazmat. Nobody moves patients until the all clear. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never performed emergency medicine under actual pressure, the kind of confidence that only exists in the absence of real stakes. Danielle was checking Commander Vickers' neuro responses when she smelled it. Not the sharp industrial reek of chlorine gas, but something deeper, the chemical signature of a mass exposure event, the specific flavor of disaster she had recognized exactly once before, in a field hospital outside Sangin where a mortar round had ruptured a depot of chemical stores 2 kilometers upwind. She knew the timeline. She knew what came next. Respiratory failure within minutes. Pulmonary edema within hours. Cardiac arrest if they didn't intervene in the next 8 minutes. She moved. Not toward the exit. Not toward Dr. Caldwell's orders. Toward the code cart, her hand already reaching for the supplies her body remembered from a life that had been officially erased from existence. Muscle memory took over, the kind that lives in bone and sinew, that survives courts-martial and buried service records and explicit orders never to surface. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle, her movements precise as a surgical laser. The patient in Trauma Bay 3 was blue-lipped and gasping, his lungs filling with fluid faster than his body could process it. Turn him on his side, she called out to the med student frozen beside the stretcher. The younger man moved like he was underwater. Danielle's gloved hands found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She could hear Caldwell behind her, his voice now edged with the sharp panic of a man watching his authority dissolve. "Ross, I said evacuate. That is a direct order." She didn't acknowledge him. The needle went in with a soft hiss of air escaping, the sinus rhythm of a pneumothorax releasing pressure. The patient gasped, his oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 71 to 78. She was already moving to the next critical patient before Caldwell could finish his next sentence. The improvised chest seal came from her meal prep container in her locker, a piece of rigid plastic packaging, antibiotic ointment from the crash cart, and 3 pieces of surgical tape applied with the fluid precision of someone who had held a battlefield amputation kit and made decisions that meant the difference between a soldier walking out or being carried out in pieces. 1 hand, 2 hands, pressure and seal. She could feel the lung expanding beneath her palms. Breath returning. The patient's eyes focusing. His hand gripping her wrist. "I've got you," she said, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with hospital protocols and everything to do with the 16 hours she had held a field hospital alone while mortar rounds walked across the roof and her hands had been the only thing standing between alive and dead for an entire platoon 3 kilometers away. The ER transformed around her. 11 patients. 11 crises compressed into the kind of temporal impossibility that only exists in trauma medicine, where seconds are measured in systolic pressure and minutes in neurological function and the entire universe contracts to the size of a single human chest. She moved between them like she had done this 1,000 times. Perhaps she had. Perhaps the years of invisibility, of pushing pills and checking vitals and accepting humiliation from mediocre men, had been the real cover operation, not hiding from the military that had ordered her erased, but hiding from herself the absolute certainty that she could still do this better than anyone else in the building. Oxygen. Airway. Circulation. The trinity of trauma, and she was conducting it while Dr. Caldwell stood frozen at the nurse's station, watching his authority become irrelevant in real time. By 03:11, she had stabilized 11 patients. By 03:12, the hazmat team arrived and declared the exposure contained. By 03:13, the first federal responders were setting up perimeter equipment in the parking lot, and Dr. Caldwell's face had darkened to the color of old bruises. He had given her a direct order. She had disobeyed it. She had saved every single patient, and in doing so, had made him invisible in his own emergency department. He would not forgive her for that. Within 18 hours, the retaliation began with surgical precision. He reassigned her entire support staff to other shifts. The paramedics who knew her work ethic and covered her back. The respiratory therapists who ran her labs without question. The orderlies who moved at the speed of her requests rather than standard protocol. Gone. She would work solo shifts. Overnight. The graveyard rotation where mistakes die quietly and nobody hears the sound of orders not followed. He altered the medication dispensary access next, requiring supervisor override for every single pull. Danielle had to wait for Caldwell's approval to access basic analgesics for her patients. He granted it slowly, methodically, each delay a small suffocation of her autonomy. She knew what he was doing. She had seen the technique before, death by 1,000 tiny restrictions until the target either quit or made the mistake that would justify termination. Then came the phone calls. 3 of them, to 3 different board members, each placed with Caldwell's characteristic precision. A reckless nurse with a hero complex. Possibly falsified credentials. Endangering patients to satisfy her own need for recognition. The narrative was simple, elegant, lethal. And he had planted enough seeds that by the time the hospital administrator's office demanded her personnel file for review, the doubt had already taken root. The federal security clearance embedded in her background check triggered an automated alert to a Pentagon office that monitored the buried identities of deep cover operatives. The system did exactly what it was designed to do: flag the anomaly, begin the notification sequence, trigger the bureaucratic machinery that had been waiting 8 years for any sign of her resurfacing. But Caldwell had already set his final move in motion. Thursday at 1600, he summoned her to the administrator's office. 2 HR representatives. The administrator looking uncomfortable in the way that people do when they're holding documents they know are lies but lack the courage to question. Miss Ross, you are terminated effective immediately for gross negligence and policy violations. You directly violated evacuation protocol, endangering yourself and others. She sat perfectly still. I saved 11 lives. Caldwell leaned forward, and she could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the look of a small man who had finally managed to destroy something larger than himself. You violated a direct order. You're lucky I'm not filing criminal charges. She stood. Took her badge off. Placed it on the desk with the kind of measured composure that had been forged in field hospitals and carved deeper by years of absorbing humiliation from men who would never understand that the most dangerous people in any room are the ones who have already survived everything. One breath. She held it. I've been erased before, Doctor. I'm used to it. That night she stood at a bus stop in Jacksonville, rain hammering down like applause for a show that had ended badly. The cardboard box was balanced on her hip, growing heavier as water soaked through the bottom. Inside was the cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," a dying succulent from her locker, and the photograph of Corporal Martinez grinning in desert fatigues, sandblasted and faded from 8 years of being the one image she allowed herself to keep. She had carried his body 3 kilometers through sniper fire. She had held his hand when there was no one else to hold it. She had promised his mother she would bring him home. The bus was 17 minutes late. Water dripped from her hair onto the sidewalk. She didn't cry. The grief and the rage and the 7 years of silence lived somewhere deeper than tears, somewhere that only came out when people with medical certifications thought they could give orders that mattered. She sat on the bench and waited for the bus and thought about the dog tag around Vickers' neck, Martinez's name, worn smooth by his own hands, a weight he had been carrying as his penance or his prize or some complicated mixture of both. She had saved his life. The protocol said she should not have. The man standing behind the nurse's station had ordered her not to. But that had not stopped her. And in exactly 2 days, someone was going to walk through those hospital doors and realize that the woman they had tried to erase was exactly what the Pentagon had been looking for all along. The bus pulled up. The doors hissed open. She picked up the cardboard box and stepped inside, water still dripping from the broken chain that had once held a weight she was never supposed to carry. Within 18 hours of the gas leak, Dr. Caldwell moved with surgical precision. He didn't rage or threaten. He simply reassigned every member of Danielle's night shift support staff to other rotations, her charge nurse, her respiratory therapist, the orderly who had always helped her turn patients. Each reassignment was documented, justified, buried in administrative notices sent during the day shift when she was sleeping. No one questioned it. Hierarchy protected him. He was the director. Then he altered the master schedule. Danielle's name appeared in isolation on every overnight rotation. Solo. No backup. No float nurse within 3 floors. The medication dispensaries received new access restrictions, her login credentials flagged for additional verification on every pull, adding 30 seconds to each drug administration. 30 seconds sound small until you're standing in front of a crashing patient and the system demands you wait. The third move was the phone calls. 3 of them, made from his office with the door closed, his voice low and measured. Board member Patricia Chen at home on a Thursday evening. I have serious concerns about Major Ross's credibility. She bypassed direct orders during the gas leak emergency. Her credentials may be falsified, there are gaps in her employment history that don't add up. Board member David Sterling the next morning. A reckless nurse with a hero complex is a liability. She's willing to violate protocol if she thinks she knows better. That's how people die. And finally, to the chief medical officer, his brother-in-law. I'm recommending immediate suspension pending investigation. She's unstable, possibly fabricating her background. We need to protect the hospital. The whisper campaign moved faster than sound. By Friday, hospital administration had flagged her personnel file for review. They didn't tell her yet. They just initiated the inquiry, checking her background, cross-referencing her credentials, asking questions about the gaps in her employment history that every buried operative carries like scars. That's when the classified security clearance embedded in her background check triggered a federal flag. The system was supposed to work slowly. Investigations take time. Paperwork moves through channels. Caldwell knew this. He had 7 days before the federal inquiry would ping through to his inbox, before someone in Washington would see that flag and start asking questions that would unravel everything he'd built. 7 days to move faster than the government. He did it in 18 hours. The termination letter came on Saturday morning. Gross negligence. Policy violations. Failure to follow direct orders during a medical emergency. Insubordination. It was 3 pages, each word chosen to sound professional, each charge documented with twisted half-truths. The letter was effective immediately. No severance. No appeal window. No mention of the federal inquiry that would have complicated his narrative. He had terminated her before the clearance verification could proceed, moving fast enough to lock the door before anyone could see what was really behind it. The rain started at dusk that Saturday. Soft at first, then harder, the kind of rain that soaks through everything eventually. Danielle stood at a bus stop on Atlantic Boulevard with a cardboard box balanced on her hip. The box contained the remains of 8 years at Oak Creek Memorial. A cracked ceramic mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a gift from the night shift after she'd talked down a violent patient with nothing but a steady voice and 2 minutes of her time. A dying succulent in a ceramic pot, brown at the edges, gasping for water it would never get. And a photograph in a plastic frame, 5 inches by 7, showing a man grinning at the camera with his arm around another service member's shoulders. Desert camouflage. Sangin Valley. 2012, that was Martinez. That was the man whose name was etched on a dog tag that Commander James Vickers had worn like a trophy around his neck while Danielle held the medical bay together with sutures and prayer. The rain hammered down. It dripped from the cardboard box and soaked through the bottom corner, but she didn't move. She stood there at the bus stop with the box pressed against her hip and her other hand reaching out to touch the photograph through the plastic. Her fingers traced the edge of Martinez's face, the smile he'd carried into a valley and never brought back out. This was the moment. This was where the trembling started. Her hands shook. Not from cold. Not from fear. From the weight of 18 hours of precision dismantling. From the understanding that Caldwell had studied her vulnerabilities the way a surgeon studies anatomy, found the soft tissue between her ribs and pressed in with the kind of competence that only comes from someone who understands institutional power. He hadn't just fired her. He'd erased her. He'd made sure that when the federal flag arrived, it would find no one there to receive it. The box trembled in her grip. Rain soaked her scrubs. The photograph showed Martinez still grinning, still alive in plastic and emulsion, still dead in every way that mattered. She had saved 11 lives during the gas leak. 11 lives because her hands remembered how to hold people together when everything was breaking. And for that, they had fired her. The bus pulled up. Hydraulic doors hissed open like a held breath finally exhaled. She didn't board it. She stood there with the cardboard box in her trembling hands, watching the rain hammer the pavement in that terrible rhythm that sounds like applause for a show that's already ended. What she didn't know, what nobody knew except the Marine IT administrator sitting in his basement apartment in Jacksonville, was that every frame of security footage still existed. Every moment of her hands moving through the chaos. Every save. Every violation of Caldwell's useless orders. Backed up. Preserved. And already sitting in the inbox of a federal agent in Arlington, Virginia, waiting for Monday morning and the official start of an investigation that would move faster than any termination letter ever could. But that wasn't the worst part for Caldwell. The worst part was that the classified flag wouldn't go away just because she did. The worst part was that someone in the Pentagon had already seen her name and started asking questions that no hospital director could answer. The worst part was that he had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. 2 days later, a black Suburban pulled into the parking lot of Oak Creek Memorial. Like this video if you think she made the right call. But was the punishment enough? Or did he deserve worse? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe and hit that bell.